Kia ora. Hello. As you might have figured out by now, I'm a huge fan of the 14th century. There's so much conflict, social upheaval, technological and academic innovation happening during this period. Because of this, I'm going to give an overview of the conflicts, catastrophes, and events to help give a better context to people recreating the 14th century. This will also give some context to some of our later videos. This week we are going to look at the beginning of the 14th century and the Great European Famine. It is here I feel that all the little cogs are put into place that sets Europe up for the modern era. So let's have a look at some of the terrible things that happened to set this all into motion, shall we? As usual, I'll link all of my research down below. I'm Andrew, and this is Populaurbanum, a show where we discuss reenactment and the medieval middle class. When the medieval period is imagined, it is either a quiet agrarian place, full of calm peasant workers tending to the fields of their lords, or it is a horrid, dirty, violent place full of starving dogs and mercenary criminals. Welcome to the Great Famine in the 14th century, the place where the worst things in the world ever happened. A time of famine, plague, war, and death. If you were alive then, you would not be wrong to believe that the world was ending. In fact, they did. The century kicked off with a great famine, hence the name. Theories as to the cause differ. It may have been the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of the Little Ice Age, or it may have been caused by an extended volcanic eruption by Mount Tarawera here in New Zealand. During the medieval warm period, Europe had a population boom. It is estimated that prior to 1300 that the population levels were comparable to 19th century Europe. This was all to end, however. In the spring of 1315, it began to rain. That rain did not go away. It rained all through spring and into summer as well. With the rains came flooding. This damaged farmland. Summers were colder than usual. The skies were darker and unusually overcast. This damaged the ability for crops to germinate and resulted in reduced harvests. Hay was unable to be brought in, and it was impossible to dry, reducing fodder. This rain lasted through 1315 into 1316. Winter was unusually cold. Great rains and rainstorms and flooding was reported from Russia to France during this period. Nowhere was unaffected. Cattle started to suffer a murrain, the medieval term for cattle diseases. What this disease was is unknown. Sheep and cows became sick and died. Up to 60% of cattle died during this period. Meat became scarce because of this. A true famine had swept Europe. While the last reports of inclement weather were in 1317, the famine would last until 1322 in some places. By the end of 1315, all existing grain stocks were exhausted. The cost of food skyrocketed. Both wheat and oats were 4 times the price than they normally were. People could not afford what was left. The quality of the grain that could be found was of such poor quality it was hardly sufficient to nourish. Food was next to impossible to obtain. When King Edward II stopped with his household for the Feast of St. Lawrence, it was practically impossible to find bread for the court. Towns and cities were harder hit. They relied on food to be transported from the country. Those in the country, however, could keep some in surplus for themselves. The poor were the hardest hit of all, unable to find enough money to pay the exorbitant prices now just for the basics. It was not just grains that were affected. Salt, meat, wine, ale, and other resources increased in cost. The guilds and the church tried their best to feed the poor, but it was too overwhelming. Hospitals were overcrowded with people seeking help. Many cities founded second hospitals and almshouses in response. People would travel days to find food. There was a great migration across Europe in search of food. People had turned to eating leaves and roots of trees and catching fish from streams to stave off hunger. Frogs and other small animals was all there was available, as game had become scarce. People were forced to eat dogs and cats, and even the dung of doves. They ate the tainted meat of the diseased and dead animals. Parents abandoned their children, and infanticide was reported. Finally, people in desperation turned to cannibalism, both as strangers and their families. It is believed the story of Hansel and Gretel may have originated from this time, two children abandoned by their parents in the woods, to be taken in by a witch who tries to trap them and throw them in an oven. Disease was soon to follow the famine. The cold, wet weather, lack of food, and terrible conditions all led to the spread of disease. Dysentery, anthrax, ergotism from eating contaminated rye, and erysipelas, or St. Anthony's fire, which is a bacterial infection of the skin, and if left untreated, is fatal, affected the population. All of these diseases are fatal. People moved through the countryside in search of food, often in droves and travelling great distances to find food. Those that could no longer muster the strength to travel lay in the mud on the sides of the road or in the streets. Great trenches were dug in the cemeteries to bury the dead at public expense, otherwise in pits outside the city. Because of the lack of food, crime increased. Any foodstuffs that could be stolen was fair game. But it was not just food that was at risk. Anything that could be stolen was. It could easily be sold to buy food. There was an increase of assaults during this period, and an increase of banditry and piracy as well. In April 1317, it is recorded that Madog ap Iorwerth, a doctor, and Eon ap Anaon ap Robin were arraigned before the great court of Dyffryn Clwyd, together with their associate Iorwerth ap Eon Escoban. Madog and Eon were charged with imposing a ransom on the people of the lordship, extorting food and money from householders under the threat of burning their homes and killing them. All three pled innocent, but were found guilty by a jury and hung. When their goods were sold by the court, it was found that they had nothing but the clothes on their backs, worth a mere 18 pence, the value of just a few handfuls of wheat. For the church, it struggled to respond to the famine, as people expected the religious leaders to intervene on their behalf with God. Prayer failed to work, so surely this must be divine punishment. Similar opinions would be shared by the populace during the coming of the Black Death. The only response the church could muster was to offer food and succor to the dying. The church arranged prayers and rituals in an attempt to retreat with God. Processions of people became common, often barefoot. Guillaume de Nungus wrote, "We see a large number of both sexes, not only from nearby places, but from places as much as 5 leagues away, barefooted, and many even excepting the women, in a completely nude condition, with their priests coming together in procession at the Church of the Holy Martyr, and they devoutly carried bodies of the saints and other relics to be adored." The Archbishop of Canterbury declared that people go barefoot in London to procession on Friday to the Church of the Holy Trinity, bearing the Blessed Sacrament and holy relics. Yet while all this went on, kings still attempted to raise and provision armies to fight wars. The Scots, flush with their success at Bannockburn, were raiding at the English border, but were turned back due to provisioning. So too was the English counter-invasion. King Edward arranged for grains to be shipped in from France on December 18, 1315. Yet in July 3rd and September 15, 1316, he ordered his sheriffs to collect food for his garrisons at Berwick to wage war on the Scots. The French attempted to invade the Flemish lowlands, but could not due to floods and rains, and instead saw their failure as punishment for their failure to invade. The famine may have been responsible for the weakening of the population of Europe before the next great disaster, the Black Death. A whole generation suffered malnutrition during this period, which would have arrested their immune systems. weakening them against the oncoming disaster of the Great Mortality of the Black Death in 1347. While there was a crisis of food resources during this period, some of the blame of the famine can be laid at the feet of the ruling elites and their failure of the manorial system. Since a bulk of taxation was made in the form of grains, there was a resistance in setting maximum prices on existing stocks. This resulted in profiteering. Additionally, the nobility and clergy turned to their usual practices during times of crisis, which was to shrink their households, leading to unemployment and further starvation. What followed the Great Famine was a period of great strife and conflict. The late medieval period, in contrast to the high medieval period which preceded it, was now much crueler and less charitable. Whether the Great Famine was the linchpin for change or just the first in a series of events that would sweep through Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries has yet to be thoroughly investigated. What I am confident in saying, though, is that after this event we see an acceleration of ideas, technologies, and social change. Slow at first, but still there. Gone is the relative stability of the high medieval period. Europe is now slowly heading into a time of great change and great conflict.
Hi, you're still here. That means you enjoyed the video. Remember, like, comment and subscribe. And stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.